Hey, you guys. It is really great to be here with you. And I am really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for coming. I want to start by just mentioning it is Black History Month. And hopefully that's going to be a big part of what we talk about today. Because we're here to talk about environmental justice and economic justice and racial justice, because it's all the same thing. So that's the conversation we're going to have. I want to specifically thank Deb Morrow from Tell Them Tuesday for being here and for supporting me. And I want to thank Michael Brown, councilman, for his support and endorsement. And this is a conversation, but I just want to talk for 1 second a little bit about why I care so much about this. So I don't know if you know, my mom was a teacher in the New York public schools. And after that, after she retired as a teacher, she went and taught prisoners at the Brooklyn House of Detention. And she was doing this during the civil rights movement, and this was her way of participating in the civil rights movement. My mom saw being a teacher in the public schools as her way of giving a chance and contributing to the future success of the kids in those schools and the success of the people who were incarcerated at the Brooklyn House of Detention. My dad was the first generation in his family to go to college. He graduated from college at 18. My grandfather was a plumber. And my father went to law school, then he went into the Navy in World War II. He quit the law to go into the Navy and answer the country's need. And he ended up prosecuting the Nazi war criminals after the war at the Nuremberg trials. And he saw that as a country which failed to stand up against injustice and evil. And I was born in 1957. I was born right in the middle of the civil rights movement. And when he would talk about prosecuting Nazi war criminals, he talked about it in the context of civil rights, about what happens to a society when they don't oppose evil, and how important it is at every turn, as soon as possible, as hard as possible, to stand up for what's right. And so when we were growing up, though my parents were making the point that everybody knows that the only thing it takes for evil to flourish is for good people to do nothing. And that's why I started the Need to Impeach movement. Is if you see something really wrong at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, then you have to stand up and do something about it and push back as early and hard as possible. And look, a reporter said to me on the phone today, he said, the fact that Mr. Trump was exonerated, does that mean that you were wrong to do it? And I said, well, let me be clear. Mr. Trump was not exonerated. There was a cover-up. There were no witnesses. There was no trial. In fact, Mr. Trump never will be exonerated because he's guilty as heck. And so when we're talking about, let's remember that what those Republican senators said was, we refuse to put the truth in front of the American people. We don't care about the truth. We're standing up for the Republican Party over America itself and the American people. I get that. I'm good with that. You guys want to break your oath to the Constitution and do what's wrong in public? I'm good with that. But we now get to go face them in November of 2020. And let me say, as someone who is the son of my mother and the son of my father, there is going to be no excuse for not sending him packing in November of 2020. We are going to do that. We are going to turn out. This is going to be the most important vote that we're ever going to see, and the way we're going to know it is the turnout's going to be higher than anyone's ever seen that is alive in this room. We are going to send him packing along with the rest of those guys. I will stop. I do want to get to this conversation, but let me say something. There is something wrong here. I didn't start need to impeach on a whim. There is something wrong here. There is a group of people doing wrong. And if Americans don't stand up for what's right, we go to a terrible place. But there are tens of millions more of us than there are of them. So the only question is, do we show up on November 3rd, 2020? Do we have a reason to show up? Are we galvanized to do it? Do we know what's at stake? And I guarantee you, I will do every single thing I can do to make sure that the broad coalition of Democrats and Americans shows up to turn out this man the way he should have been thrown out of office by the Senate of the United States. Should we get going?
Thank you, Tom, Mr. Steyer. I'm President CEO, I'm Charles Steele Jr., President CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. I'm in the same position of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We don't endorse candidates, but if I could, I'd move on now. If I could, it would be for someone who believes in reparation. It would be someone who believes in inclusiveness. It is to be someone who believes in eradicating racism. Racism is destroying America and the whole world. When I hear someone saying they're going to make America eradicated from racism, poverty, and militaristic to control the whole world, it gets my attention. I'm talking about getting out to vote. You got to get out to vote. When I hear somebody talking about eradicating poverty, Dr. King said America is too rich to have any poverty. When I hear someone who's saying that they're going to invest in the black community, African Americans, on economic development, have access to capital so we can get loans, build homes. Do you realize we have lost 60% of black wealth? Hello? 60% of black wealth. What's our black wealth? We don't manufacture no automobiles. We don't own no oil fields. What's our black wealth? Our homes. Tom Steyer and his wife have built affordable housing all over this country through their bank. I'm talking about, I want to build for the next generation. I want people to be able not to just have a checking account, but have some money in the check. Too many times the check will bounce like a basketball. You are restricted from getting loans. You're restricted from investing in the properties for the next generation. As I close, we must realize what Tom just said. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Hello? Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. I'm going to close with Dr. King. I travel the whole world, and I'm in his position. I'll be less than who I am and a person concerned about others if I didn't ask you to get out to vote. But if I could vote, I would vote for reparation. If I could vote, I would vote for those who care about poor people. If I could vote, I would say, as Dr. King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. I see some light up in here, and I'm not talking about the news reporters. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that, because love is what love does. I see some hope up in this room. I ain't endorsing nobody because I can't do it. But if I could, I see some hope. You got to have hope in order to go into the future. And I want to say, Tom, even though I can't endorse you, I endorse reparation. I endorse the Poor People campaign that I'm involved in. involved in opening up the banks and have affordable housing. I'm involved in, Dr. King said, the 3 ills in society. I know I'm going to close now. Dr. King said the 3 ills in society happens to be racism, poverty, and militarism. But if I could endorse, that's what I would endorse. Somebody who stands for those principles. Love is what love does. Let's get out and vote.
So like most candidates, they're afraid to have the cameras and you ask them the questions. That's not this man here. He wants to hear it. The only way you're going to fix it, you got to hear it. So that's why he's here today, to hear from you. So who wants to start this conversation with Tom Steyer? Uh-oh. Hey, he was brave enough to do it. Yes, sir.
I don't know what to say. Okay.
That sounds like 45.
How you doing? I probably should have done more research ahead of time, but I'd rather hear you say it in person. What is your idea on the student loan crisis in this country?
Student loans. So let's start by saying 44 million people in this country have student loans. Half of them delay getting married or having a kid because of those loans, which means they're sitting on their heads incredibly hard. I view education as the future prosperity of America and the future justice of America. Everybody's got to be able to afford to go to college. So I want to talk about 2 things. First of all, here's my plan. 2 years of free community college, 1% loans. These loans grow. If you get $30,000 worth of loans, you pay back $80,000 or $90,000. I want there to be 1% rate, so you pay back $30,000 worth of loans, and every dollar you go goes to pay it down. And lastly, if you go into a job that's community or country service, military, teacher, nurse, social worker, at the end of 10 years, it just goes away. So I want to make sure that college is affordable for everyone. And let me say, here in South Carolina, I also have a plan to put $125 billion into the historically black colleges and universities. That is a multiple of what anyone has ever talked about, but as somebody who is for reparations, for somebody who believes that policy comes out of narrative, I think we need to go back and take a look at exactly what the historically black colleges and universities have done and why. They were founded because black kids weren't allowed to go to the mainline colleges and universities. And they've produced over half of black judges, generals, doctors, teachers, engineers. They've worked, and they're being starved for cash so that kids who go there are coming out with disproportionately high student loans because they don't have big endowments, and they've lost 40% of their federal funding over the last decade. $125 billion is a statement that we're not just going to support HBCUs, but they're going to go to a level that's new and different and broader because they need to, and because they've succeeded, and because there's a mission here that society demands that we accomplish successfully. So in answer to your question about student, and that will bring down the cost of going to historically black colleges and universities. I view education, look, I think Trump stinks on economics. To me, the future of our country is investing in ourselves. And that specifically involves education. That, in fact, if we don't invest really, really early, I'm for universal pre-K. It's critical to get to people early. It's our future prosperity. He's incompetent. He doesn't realize this. This is how people succeed in the 21st century, by being productive and educated. But it's also our future justice. If we aren't giving people, young kids, the chance starting at 3 or earlier to be supported and succeed, then we are legislating inequality for the next generation. So, in answer to your question, my mom's a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher, my uncle was a teacher, my brother has been a representative of at-risk kids for his career and his life. I view this as the critical statement about future prosperity, but also how we transform America from a justice standpoint and give every kid a chance to go as far as he or she can. We say we do it, we don't do it. Now we have to do it, and I promise I will. Is it on?
Hello? There we go. Hi, Mr. Steyer. So climate change is poised to about 1 billion more people in the face of infectious diseases like coronavirus, like malaria, and exacerbate current pandemics like HIV and tuberculosis. What, as president, are you going to do to respond to these pandemic crises that get exacerbated by climate, but also helping the poorest of countries respond to critical health problems and strengthen their health systems?
And can you mention your name? Hey, Diana, can you make sure, just so everybody can know who is asking the question?
Matthew Rose.
Nice to meet you. So you should know that I'm the only person running for president who says that climate is his or her number one priority. That I've worked on this for more than a decade. I started by saying that environmental justice and racial justice and economic justice are inseparable. They're inseparable. They are one thing. So when I talk about climate, people think it's a science issue. Like, what are the parts per million? And what's happening down in the Antarctic? And that's all relevant, and I follow that really closely. But I've always looked at this as a human issue. And there's a gigantic racial undertone to that human issue, which is if you travel around this country, which I've done, and you see where the asthma rates are skyrocketing, that's black and brown communities. I'm from California. We have some places with 92% rates of childhood asthma. I've been to Denmark, South Carolina. I know who lives in Denmark. I've been to Flint, Michigan. I know who lives in Flint. I've been up and down the San Joaquin Valley. I know who lives in East Porterville, California. So you're asking me what I'll do at home and internationally. Declare a state of emergency on day one. Do it from the standpoint of environmental justice, that we will clean up the air and water as a way of making sure that our climate policy is just and deals with human needs and justice. We were on the phone. I don't know if you guys know that Harold is one of the most prominent environmental justice leaders in the United States of America. Do you know that? Seriously. We were on the phone this morning with a group of people who are environmental justice leaders, including Mustafa Ali, who also worked with Harold here. I would declare a state of emergency and start putting in rules of what corporations, how they generate energy, what kind of cars they produce, what kind of buildings they live in. Internationally, am I aware that what this is going to lead to? Yes. The United States has to lead internationally because this is an international problem. And if we don't attack it as a group of nations, we lose. We cannot solve this inside the borders of the United States. So what does that mean? First of all, it means you have to declare a state of emergency, because why else would they listen to the biggest polluter in history unless we're on our front foot and are saying we're taking it really seriously, and we're asking you to take it really seriously. But then the question becomes, how are we going to convince other people to come along with us? And we are going to have to be moral leaders again. I mean, it's hard to, we once were the moral leaders of the world. That's who we are. That's what the country was created to be: freedom, justice, equality. We have to go back to trying to lead morally in the world. We're going to have to provide finance. When we talk about countries, we're going to have to make it possible for them to move to clean energy. Technologically, we can do this, I promise, financially and commercially. And so when we think about how are we going to deal with global pandemics, which was part of your question, the answer is together. I mean, if you think, this is the last thing I'll say, think about Mr. Trump's foreign policy. It's called America First. America First was a pro-Nazi organization in the United States in the 1930s and early 40s. Really. It was a pro-Nazi organization. His idea is you can't trust, his whole point is you can't trust us. You know, we're out for ourselves. If we can take advantage of you, we will. You know, we're not a partner, we're not an ally, we're not even honest. We just are in it for ourselves. You can't solve global pandemics with a group of countries that say, we'll take advantage of you if we get a chance. For us to succeed internationally, we have to go back to the idea that America leads a coalition of countries who share our values, make the world safer and more prosperous. And if there's a better example than climate or global pandemics, I don't know what it is, but I can tell you President Obama did this. He led morally. He put together coalitions of our allies. If you look at the Iran nuclear agreement, it's a classic example of presidential leadership from a value standpoint, and so is the Paris Climate Treaty. So when you ask what are we going to do, we're going to use all of our tools, morality, technology, finance, commerce, to make the world better for everybody, including American citizens, safer and better. But we're going to have to reinvent America as the leader of the world again, which, by the way, we should be, and it kills me that we're not.
I'm sorry.
Yep. Hi, Tom. I'm Kathy.
Kathy, nice to meet you.
You too. I just wanted to see your views on universal health care, because climate change leads into that. There's a lot of people that don't have health care, and we need it.
So, Kathy, let me say this. Healthcare, as far as I'm concerned, affordable healthcare is a constitutional right for every American in the 21st century. And I know not everybody's getting it. So first of all, I believe that. And second of all, I believe it's way too expensive because the American government is in the pocket of drug companies, insurance companies, and private hospitals. Look, the companies own the government. Yeah, that's very, very clear. And it's never more clear than in healthcare. So what is my feeling? I am one of the people who thinks that we should build off the Affordable Care Act. We should have a public option where anyone can join Medicare. We should use the power of the government to drive down costs, and we should make it possible for everyone to have it. But I wouldn't throw out all of our existing system and all the people who get their health care through their employment, because people have negotiated for that for decades and they like it. My goal is to make the public option on the Affordable Care Act so cheap and so attractive that all those people who think that they're employment-based health care, tens of millions whom are union workers, go to their employers and say, give us the money, we'll buy the public option, and we'll get a raise. Everybody has to, look, it's a constitutional right. It's the 21st century. Martin Luther King was saying, we're the richest country in the history of the world. When they say we can't afford it, that's a lie. We can afford health care, and it's a right. Look, they have bought the government. And I'm running in large part to take it back. Climate is oil companies saying, I'd rather you all suffer and die than we have a bad quarter of earnings at ExxonMobil. We can't put up with this anymore. There is something going on in this society that's so dark and so wrong that it's really incumbent on Americans to take back this government. Look, that's why I'm for term limits, 12 years for Congress people and senators. And I always say to people, you need new and different people in charge. And if you want the 6-word argument for term limits, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz. Term limits, new, different people in charge.
Mr. Steyer, all of your arguments are very persuasive, especially to people in this room and in other parts of the country. And they make a lot of sense. The problem is that I see, especially here in the South, our Trump supporters are not willing to listen or be influenced by those kinds of arguments. A lot of it because Trump himself has created this us against them. But I run into it every day. I've got a Bernie sticker on my car from the last election, and people roll down their window and say, "You're a damn socialist." And when you try to say, "Well, what has Trump done for you?" They can't say anything other than they feel like they've been listened to. So how do you convince those people that you're going to need some of those people?
So I know this is true. And when I'm not here, I mean, obviously I'm in South Carolina, but I learned this most in South Carolina because I was here doing an impeachment forum about over a year ago. And somebody stood up at the forum and said, "I don't believe this, but my in-laws are Trump supporters, and they believe that he is an imperfect vessel sent by God to prepare us for the end of days. Could you comment?" So I said, well, there are two things I'd say. One is, there is no sentence in the English language that I disagree with more than Donald Trump was sent by God. That's ridiculous. But the second thing is, I don't have enough time to convince any of those people. If they think he was sent by God, I want to spend my time doing something besides talking to them and trying to convince them differently. And this is my honest to God answer, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. There are tens of millions of Americans who don't vote. And they don't vote because they think the system has been bought by corporations. Neither party tells the truth. Nobody cares actually about them. So why would I participate in a failed system that doesn't really work for me? That's our people. Those people, that's the beginning of a conversation about what happens when we all turn out and win. I don't think we can convince the Trump lovers to change, and I don't think we should waste our time. We're not Republicans. We're not like Republicans, but a little nicer. We're not like Republicans, and we're going to meet in the middle. We're different. I reject everything they stand for, just so you know. I reject the idea of cutting taxes for rich people and big corporations. I do the opposite. I reject Betsy DeVos and her idea that education doesn't matter. I was saying, I think it matters more than almost anything in terms of justice and economic growth. I reject the idea that Americans don't have a right to health care. I'm not meeting in the middle. There's no middle. It's a constitutional right that we take care of Americans and provide health care for every single one. I'm not meeting in the middle on wages. We have a $7.25 minimum wage. That is an insult. That is an absolute insult to working people. Look, I have been fighting for $15 since 2012 when I was picketing at a McDonald's. I don't think $15 is enough, just so you know. I know there's a long fight for 15, and I've been out with unions fighting for it this is the 8th year. But if you take the 1980 minimum wage and inflation adjust it, so it's just the same amount, but in 2020 dollars, it's $11. And if you include the increase in productivity and a share for workers, the minimum wage would be $22. That's what I think is a fair minimum wage. $7.25, that is an insult to working people, and it's an attempt by people who run these corporations and own the government to keep people down and keep all the money for themselves. And it's just wrong. We're not like Republicans. We want to turn the page on what they stand for.
All right, testing. Okay.
Great.
Hi, I'm Tanya McDuffie, and as the daughter of a Cuban-American woman, I'm very concerned about what's happening with immigration in our country. I have strong ties to the Hispanic community here in Spartanburg, and I teach a number of students at the college where I teach who are Hispanic and cry, worried about what's going to happen to their undocumented parents if they come to get them. What are your plans for immigration, not only with regards to current people who've been living here for decades as undocumented, but also the early arrivals and the children of those people?
So I think it's important when we talk about immigration to recognize that Mr. Trump isn't actually against immigration. He is against immigration by non-white people. This, as I like to say, there's no wall on the Canadian border. This is a guy who is using immigration to talk about race. And he's using, and as I said, look, when I was talking about reparations, I said to you guys, policy comes out of narrative. You want to do something evil? Start it with a lie. You want to torture children? Tell people their parents are rapists and murderers. That's what he did. So when I think about immigration, on day one, we will stop breaking international law and committing crimes against humanity. I promise you that. I mean, seriously, I'm not the son of a Nazi prosecutor for nothing. I mean, good grief. What they're doing is racism at its most profound in immigration. And so, look, there are 12 million people who've lived in this country for an average of 15 years. They live here, they work here, they pay taxes, their kids go to school here. They have no legal status. They are in the shadows. I am a believer in comprehensive immigration reform. Give them a legal status, give them a path to citizenship, treat them like human beings. That is exactly what I would do. And I'm for, look, it's hard not to think about immigration from the standpoint, a human standpoint. Families, how is it possible you can be a spouse and an American citizen and your spouse can't live here? I'm for DACA and DAPA and TPS. I am for America understanding that we have a responsibility to be decent, law-abiding, compassionate people, because that's what this country is supposed to be. And I see immigration that way. You know, our church has a program that has welcomed immigrants to San Francisco since 1894. And that program is called Good Samaritan. And you guys know the parable of the Good Samaritan, who's the only person who will protect and support a traveler who's been beaten up and left by the side of the road. And the Good Samaritan program, we have been supporting for years with over $1 million, and my wife was the head of the program, basically to welcome immigrants, most of them from Mexico and Central America, who come to San Francisco and get them established and teach them English and do all the things that a neighbor would do, and then they turn around and volunteer in the program. It's a human way of thinking about human beings. And isn't that really, look, America started with gross injustice. You know, this is a society that had racism and slavery in the Constitution. So we have to keep moving forward. That's why Mr. Trump's racism is so offensive, because it's actually turning back the progress to accept people as full human beings. And that's how I see immigration. I respect people as full human beings, and that's how we should treat immigrants, and that's how we should treat each other, and we should tell the truth about the past and repair the past so we can move forward.
This will be the last question.
Right. Hey, Tom, I'm Jamie. I was just wondering, before you talked about how you want to get people out to vote, I think it's really hard for a lot of people to vote, those that have served their jail time and are not allowed to vote. What are you going to do for them?
So Jamie, let me say this. I think what you're saying is that in a lot of states, previously incarcerated people lose their voting rights forever. So let me say this. It's not what I'm going to do, it's what I've done. Look, I started one of the biggest grassroots organizations in the United States called NextGen. And one of the things that we did in 2018 was work like crazy in Florida to make sure that formerly incarcerated people had their voting rights restored to them, and it passed. And let me say, but let's just say in terms of our criminal justice system, it's impossible to look at our criminal justice system and not realize that it has racial injustice from the first second to the last second, from the way we police, to the way we sentence, to the way we treat people who are incarcerated, to the way we treat people who have been incarcerated. And I was saying, that's an obvious thing. I have worked to end, just so you guys know, and we ended it, cash bail in California, because cash bail says you go to jail without ever being convicted of a crime if you don't have enough money to make bail. It never uses the word race. It has gigantic racial overtones in terms of who ends up spending time in jail and what that means to your family and your work, and also to whether you plead out. Because by the time you've spent 6 or 8 months in jail and that's count as time served, it's a completely different question, and now you have a felony on your record. So there's racial injustice from beginning to end, and unless we talk about it and deal with it, we never solve it. People are scared to talk about race in our society. But my feeling is, when did you ever solve a problem you were too scared to talk about? If you're so scared to talk about it, then it creates more power because it's so scary you won't even talk about it. And we can't do that. I think if this is our time to turn out the most corrupt president in American history, and this is our time to take on the biggest challenge in history, which is to solve the climate crisis and save the world, then isn't this also the time for us to be brave enough to talk openly about injustice and racial injustice in our society, openly deal with it, repair it, and move on? Isn't that what this country is supposed to be doing?
Hello.
Are we overruling Harold Mitchell?
Hello.
Right on.
Okay. All right. Hi. So my name is Jade Barton, and first I want to say, Dr. Steele, it's truly an honor to be in your presence today.
Let's give him a hand. Woo!
Secondly, Mr. Steyer, thank you for holding this forum. Thank you for your honest conversation, and thank you for acknowledging that even though we might not mention race in the policies that we create, the way that they're implemented definitely has high racial overtones, and we know who's most impacted. I currently work as a special education middle school teacher. So education is very, very important to me. So I have two questions in that vein. The first is, when we analyzed pre-K through 12th grade education, excluding college, what would you say is the most pressing issue, and how would you change that? And then secondly, what are your thoughts on charter schools?
Okay. So pre-K through high school. Look, I am someone who really believes what I said, that third grade reading comprehension is it's reflective of a whole background of things. And so to me, the most important thing is to get to kids as early as possible and as comprehensively as possible. So that means there are a whole bunch of things that have to happen before you get to third grade for you to be on the right path in third grade. It does involve school, it does involve food, it does involve mental health. I know how many kids have mental health issues, and I know how highly it's correlated with incarceration. So I look at this as our society basically investing in ourselves. And I always say to people, if a kid in Compton, California succeeds, productive, does well, is a good citizen, has a good life, that is fantastic for people in South Carolina. And conversely, if a kid from Columbia, South Carolina succeeds, is productive, turns out well, contributes to society, that is fantastic for everybody in California. So I view that, you asked me the most important thing to me, the most important thing is to be there early, comprehensively, with whatever it takes. We spend, and let's just say this, we spend $700 billion a year on defense. We've spent trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trillions. We spend $70 billion a year at the federal level on education. Not 700 billion, not trillions, 70. That is a dramatic misplacement of values and money, in my opinion. We can afford all this stuff. We just have to care and understand what matters. And about charter schools, look, I believe in the public school system, and I believe in public school teachers. Charters don't address the basic issue. So to me, this is about supporting teachers really broadly. Paying them more? Yes. Oh, they're way underpaid. I know that. But it's not just pay. It's about having nurses in schools and mental health professionals in schools and librarians in schools and letting teachers get continuing education so they continue to improve and get better. So to me, the question here is, how do we support the whole public education process so teachers can succeed? They run the classrooms. And let me say this. I have a profoundly different impression of what education is than Betsy DeVos or Donald Trump. They think it's an expense for corporations. It's not, and therefore should be minimized. What can we get away with? I don't see it that way. This is an investment that pays off over and over and over in so many multiple ways. So to me, if you said to me, we're doubling the amount we're spending on education, if you could show that it worked, I'd be all for it. Because this is a great investment, and when you get great investments, you go into them big time. And that's what we should be doing in our society. And I believe that really the public system is the system that drives everything. I support the teachers. I think, at least in my home state of California, the charter school movement is an anti-union movement at some level. And I'm a big union person. I believe there's been an attack on working people for 40 years, an attempt to break the right to organize, the right to stand up to each other, with each other, and to negotiate for ourselves. So does that answer your question? Can you tell I care about this? This is a huge, want to talk about racial justice? You got to talk about education. You want to talk about economic justice? You got to talk about education. And if you want to talk about environmental justice, this is one big question about how do we think about Americans together. If we don't value Americans, we think it's okay to poison them. I couldn't disagree more profoundly.
This is the unscripted man that you see, the real deal here. And I know we've been used to looking at 45 where he can't even read the briefings, putting us in the positions that we're in. But this is what we need. This is what it's going to take to get rid of 45. So I know that you got to be stirred up and ready to go. Stirred up. Trump's got to go. Stirred up. Trump's got to go. Let's go.
Thank you, guys. Let's go get him on the 29th.
Let's go get him tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a photo line just to the right here, and we're in press for time, so we're not going to have a lot of time for conversation, but we do want everyone who has a chance to meet Tom that's here. We really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.